So we're going to start here. Good evening, I'm Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC May 2nd Strategic Update. Back with me this week is Michael Steger, leading our discussion this evening. And the topic of tonight's discussion is going to be the nation state strikes back, which I think is very appropriate if people are awake and paying attention and understand the massive fight that is being waged by the patriots and citizens of this nation to reject the globalist agenda, to reject the insane policies of the Biden collective administration, to reject the idea that we're going to allow our republic and nation to be destroyed while we're giving billions of dollars to fund a Nazi-run coup and war in Ukraine by, as we will discuss momentarily here when we get more into the discussion about the dangers we face with Biden's push to give another $33 billion to Ukraine in an orchestrated war that is not being accepted by the American people, not to mention the fact that you have the operations of the so-called now Ministry of Untruth. We'll talk about that momentarily as well. But what's going on is that LaRouche PAC at the center of the fight to define really what President Trump laid out very clearly in his message and the commitment of our nation on this past Sunday in Nebraska. And if people didn't get a chance to hear, it was almost a 2-hour speech, but one of the things that was striking to me and really kind of puts a pinpoint on what we're going to be discussing tonight is when he brought up the fact that the Republican Party, and he's mentioned this a number of times before, is the working people's movement. He's saying that under his leadership and what has been catalyzed with the American people, the movement under the Republican Party has to pursue a populist and nationalist economic agenda that puts working families before globalist politicians that are fools and before multinational corporations. And as I will show you here, this is exactly what the platform of LaRouche PAC represents. How do you go about doing that? How do you actually put the nation state, the true idea of the power of the people, back into the hands of the citizens of a republic? And first of all, the headline of our website that I want to point out to people, if you didn't have a chance to watch and participate in the discussion on this past Saturday, led by Bruce Director and Dan Leach, and this is a part of an ongoing class series to rescue America. We must restore its Promethean culture. Dan did an excellent job because at the center of what defines a true nation state, a republic, this Promethean idea, the creative idea of humanity, of mankind. And this is at the forefront of what defines our republic. I will really encourage people to go back and listen to that discussion, very profound discussion. And secondly, I just want to point out a couple of other updates and reports on the website, including our intervention and what, if you look at the case study and the importance of what's going on in Michigan, not just as a single entity of what's happening in Michigan in rejecting the establishment agenda and the role of Michigan leading the charge with the MAGA movement, the Trump layers really taking charge, as we see with the article written by Susan Kokinda and Michael Steger also was there participating just this past week. They had their convention, their endorsement convention, and people who were representatives of the Trump MAGA movement were strongly endorsed. And so you can look at this and also get a sense of this is not just happening in Michigan, but it is taking off across the country as well. Michigan Republican establishment meltdown. Michigan GOP is now the party of working people and patriots. And this goes directly to the point of what I was just reading of President Trump. You also have understanding what's going on in the breakdown of our economy, our infrastructure, the water crisis. Very important article by Pat Ruckert, Spreading Western Droughts Threatens Food and Electrical Supply. And the next article by Brian Lance, Why is the Economy Not Working? Don't just kick the tires, look under the hood. This is very important. He goes through what's happening with the breakdown of supply chain crisis, the inflation, how the commodities pricing is completely out of control. And I would really encourage people to look at that and read that article as well. And finally, before I turn it over to Michael, I do want to encourage everyone who is listening to this call or will be listening to this call in the aftermath of the discussion on YouTube to please consider going to our website and signing up to participate in the actual discussions. And you can do that by going to larouchepac.com/participate. And this will give you the opportunity to sign up for our Saturday discussions so you can engage in the ongoing dialogue as well as the talk you're listening to right now for our Monday strategic update. So with that, there's a lot more happening, but I want to see what Michael has for us this week, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
Great, thanks, Keisha. All right, so the last couple of weeks have been intense. I just want to, thank everyone for getting on these calls, for participating. This kind of dialogue and engagement is something that should be happening more throughout the country. There's a lot of intense activity. There's a lot of people active. And that's why we've encouraged the participants on these calls to get out and get active, because there is so much life and spirit to the American people today. And it's not limited to the American people. You're seeing kind of national movements happening in a number of different countries. But there is a unique role that we play and that the United States plays in this dynamic. But in that course of discussion, it really is critical that we take the time, as we did on Saturday with Bruce and Dan's classes, to take the political situation and to dive into that a little bit deeper. Because there's one aspect, which is coming to know the enemy, know thy enemy, right? And increasingly people are beginning to understand that. But it's not just what your enemy does. It's one, how your enemy thinks, and two, what is the alternative way of thinking? And that quality of consideration is perhaps some of the most important qualities of deliberation, of output, of writings, of discourse that we can have. Because, when you look at, Tony Pappert had given the discussion last week, and we emphasized and had reports from Mihua and others on the situation in Michigan. The process has erupted. There have been all kinds of attempts, including attempting to purge Trump, America First Republicans from the state Republican caucus in the state house. Matt Maddock, the husband of Michonne Maddock, who's a state co-chair of the party, was tossed out of the state house Republican caucus. Now, this is just attempted revenge for what happened during the Michigan convention. The question is, who's purging who? As this Republican establishment, or as the globalists who have run the Republican Party attempt to try to purge the grassroots, you would probably say, from all appearances, that the effect is they're purging themselves. And that's a very good thing, that the more they expose their own vitriolic hatred of anything patriotic and beautiful and profound about the United States and its people, the more they remove themselves and eliminate themselves from having any ability to rule or run the country. And that's a good thing. But then the other thing comes up. People that are now taking power, who have been just focused and determined to eradicate treason from the general party apparatus and from the nation's governance, now have the remarkable and in some cases overwhelming responsibility to now implement fundamentally new policies. You know, when Trump says, and profoundly, as he did in Nebraska last night, that we are going to take this country back for the working class, for the working families, we're not going to pay heed to these stupid, idiot globalists or the multinational corporations that think that the nation's laws should be structured for them to loot it. But instead, the nation's law should be there to embolden and encourage the population itself to become stronger, more prosperous, and more capable of self-government. That we've got to now implement those policies. Now, some of them are straightforward. As many of you on this call know, the reality is it's become so bizarre and extreme that getting rid of the transgender insanity, the drugs, the violence, the idea of depolicing, these kinds of radical left insanity are a major blowback. But the natural reflex towards what's sufficient, what's necessary and sufficient, and let's put an emphasis on the idea of sufficient, is a different idea, right? We can take necessary steps. We can end all of the insanity that has been exposed over just the last couple of years. You can end the bailouts. You can stop the forever wars. But are those steps sufficient to restore the concept and idea of self-governing of our republic, of our culture? And as you know, that's been really the main underlying thematic, that from our perspective, and let me say from my perspective, it is this deeper question, something that goes beyond what we consider politics per se, into something more about what it means to be a human being, something more profound. What's often relegated to a religious questions, but as we all know, if you go to church, the profound has been taken out of the churches in many cases. So it's something that's critical, and it's critical and been an critical or a sustained part of human civilization because it has been so decisive of a role. It's played such a decisive role in determining critical moments like the one we're in today. What Trump has done in that regard is critical. Now, consider the alternative to what Biden has been doing. We just have to take this up for just a second. We all know how insane it is. It's the American people can see it, but let's just put it in quick purview, because it's part of the world we're confronting. Now, Biden is going to be going down to Alabama this week, and he's going to Lockheed Martin factory to announce the importance of the fight for democracy in Ukraine. Now, this shows you how grossly incompetent and psychotic, not Biden, because Biden doesn't know where he's going, and if he does know where he's going, he doesn't know he's there when he gets there. But the idea that a president of the United States is going to go to a weapons factory, which is making billions of dollars off of some fight for democracy. One, Ukraine's not a democracy. Two, it has nothing to do with our national interest. Three, Joe Biden and his family have been corruptly involved in what was basically a fascist coup 9 years ago in that country, overthrowing what was a legitimately elected, if still corrupt, but a legitimately elected Ukrainian government. And so Biden goes to Lockheed Martin and celebrates massive windfall profits of them selling a bunch of outdated, probably, there's reports of the Javelin tank missiles in many cases just kind of hitting the tanks and falling, that their explosive detonators are not functional. These are outdated, ill-equipped, technology and equipment that has not been sustained, maintained, and is basically just being used as a kind of massive windfall, as a kind of massive war buildup. And Joe Biden's going to go and celebrate that as some kind of way of addressing the circumstances or conditions politically of our country today. How grossly inept and out of touch. Now, the Ukraine situation, as much as I'd like to build it up that there's going to be a great victory for the Ukrainians, from every serious analyst's perspective, this is just bizarre that Russia has complete and total control on the ground. What they are doing, though, is sending in huge supplies of weapons into Western Ukraine, or attempting to, or preparing to, meaning stashing those in Slovakia or Hungary, or probably not Hungary, Poland, to then later move these weapons in. But they have lost the Ukrainian army. They're already bringing in, mercenaries. And many of those, you're not going to get a huge demand for mercenaries, as many of them go there and find out they're facing the Russian army. This is not Syria. This is not Afghanistan. This is facing the full scale and scope of the Russian military. And so you're not going to get a huge flow of mercenaries to go in there. There have been evidences of some coming in, but by no means are you going to build a 30,000, 40,000 person army. And you're not going to do that out of conscripts. The people that volunteered in Ukraine have volunteered. The anti-Russian Nazi right-wing types who wanted to fight a war with Russia, they're in the military, or they're in the so-called, brigades or National Guard, because they were so ideologically extreme they couldn't join the military. This idea of a massive arms buildup with no even viable functioning army and a cokehead clown show of a presidency in Ukraine is so-called the great fight for democracy. This is what Joe Biden's going to push at a Lockheed Martin factory in Alabama. As under Obama's orders, as people saw this, Obama has been on tour, both in New York and then Stanford, on a campaign against disinformation. That disinformation is going to kill us. We need censorship to save us. And that the Biden regime has set up their Center for Disinformation, deployed by basically an intelligence hack to handle the so-called Orwellian program. The economy is collapsing. Even the GDP rates collapsed by 1.4%. Prices have continued to go up. If they're going to continue to go up or not is not yet clear. Some will. Food prices, fuel prices, these things have remained high. Other things may be coming down. But there is no ability at this point, under these circumstances, to regain a foothold of production, of industry, of job creation. There is zero confidence. The only thing that people could have confidence in is the increasing ideological insanity of both Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, and Washington, D.C. in terms of their decision-making about the economy and about the broader policies. And so, as the American people confront this, it's not surprising that Trump's speech became more aggressive, more straightforward on the core questions of the economy. And that this even shapes, you can tell, his endorsements in certain states for his US Senate or for Congress, that he's got to build up a political movement that has a clarity of an economic perspective. So in that regard, I wanted to take up an economic element tonight. And to do that, I wanted to first situate that the Biden agenda, this idea of fighting for democracy against the authoritarian, is not something new. That was the exact same agenda and marketing, and it was outright PR marketing of Woodrow Wilson and World War I. The exact same wording. And again, we were intervening into a condition that ultimately was a world war period of devastation that lasted 25 years. From World War I through to the end of World War II, because World War I, had it been resolved by US diplomacy, might have had a very much different outcome. But because of Wilson's clear British imperial program, the United States helped initiate the Versailles Treaty, the destruction of the nation of Germany, which has never recovered, and an attempted near and total destruction of Russia with the Soviet Union. Because let's be very clear, the people behind the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution were the same people behind Joe Biden today. So this escapade, this agenda, is one that really is dying, and it's over 100-year period. We've had breaks. Franklin Roosevelt's orientation was a reprieve. John Kennedy's brief, short presidency. Reagan put opposition in. But there has been nothing like what President Trump and this new patriotic American movement has brought to bear in terms of ending what is very much a neoliberal, anti-nation state concept. Democracy. Democracy is just the right of voting, like the parliamentary system of the European Union today, where there are no longer nations. There are territories, there are regions, but there's no longer a nation. It still lingers in the minds and hearts of the people of Italy or France or Germany, but it doesn't exist as an institution, as it does in the United States and in the American people. Now, in that World War I, we also had established the Federal Reserve. We also had expanded government debt by 2,000% in just the brief period of 3 years of 1915 to 1918, 1916 to 1918. A massive expansion of government debt and a massive expansion of speculation that by 1929, that speculation in New York on the markets was larger than all the other aspects of the US economy combined. And this was still at a time when US exports of high technology were at a high level compared to GDP, 4 or 5%. This is at a time when we have developed the telephone. The rail industry was still something that was being built in a relatively new industry. Electricity, all the components and appliances that apply to telephone and telecommunications and electricity. We were a massive air flight had just begun and had become commercialized as the result of World War I. You know, the assembly line capabilities of Henry Ford that were used towards the auto industry were now expanding into broader industrial production. With all of that happening and a booming even expanse of certain standards of living, the reality was the speculation that unfolded out of the creation of the government debt for a war that was based on an ideological premise of basic British imperialism led to skyrocketing speculation, the blowouts of the Depression, and the rise of fascism globally. And fascism is globalism. There is no difference. The communism is globalism. How they may argue it, how they may present it, its PR campaign may be slightly different. But in reality, fascism, communism is in essence a globalist outlook. Now, how do we address the underlying alternative to this? Because if you're going to end a period of cultural hegemony of the last 100+ years, it is a question of restoring or introducing something that has been somehow forgotten or pushed aside. One example of how we might think of this is the oftentimes referenced Robinson Crusoe example in economics. This goes as far back as the 18th century, and people like Rousseau, the French Romantic philosopher, to libertarians today like Murray Rothbard, where the idea that you start with in building up society and building up then the premise of how an economy will function is an individual stranded on a desolate island. Now, many people might be familiar with this reference point. It's been, it's somewhat common. But the question is, why is this such a severely wrong approach? Why is taking an individual, whether it's on an island or if it's in the world itself, and saying the premise of the economy is the individual's wants, desires, needs, and those needs, wants, and desires will determine then the decision-making of that individual, because it neglects what the individual is. It assumes that a human individual can be defined biologically, and you're ultimately reducing the cognitive and self-conscious functions of the individual to a characteristic of biological traits. It's smarter at how it gets its food. It's more complicated. You're adding what you would consider a complication to a biological dynamic, rather than recognizing that there is something fundamentally different to the makeup of an individual. Now, one example of this is the question of language. Language is clearly an expression of a capacity, and broad conceptual language is clearly a capacity that far supersedes anything any other living process has been able to demonstrate, any other animal species can demonstrate. Doesn't mean that there isn't some forms of language, but to express a higher conceptual understanding, not simply a response to sense perceptions, but a response to, say, historical phenomena, has something that's not been seen. And it is there where the process of language has developed. But and in that language, we see the very importance of why free speech plays a role today, because without language, without the freedom to speak, without the freedom to express and to study the ideas of our civilization and history within a language, and essentially to share a common language for discourse with others, you lose the ability to think. You lose the ability to solve the great problems of your society. It's not simply to say things which are offensive. It's ultimately to be able to find those aspects within your civilization that can provide a solution to the crisis at hand. But that language, this concept of advanced language, still can remain something of a biological advanced characteristic. And that's why people oftentimes reference dolphins or other animals and mammals, advanced language capabilities. A hunter will talk about the two hounds and their interaction with each other as they sniff down the prey. And yet there are clearly those characteristics. And this is why the main question that's been lacking, even from some of the best conservatives out there, people that you would say are patriotic, are on the right side of the woke left insanity today. People like Jordan Peterson, who's got a strong following amongst young people. There is a complete lack of regard for a sufficient understanding of the individual, that they accept the premise of the enemy. This idea of the individual in the world making decisions in light of all the other circumstances about what's in its best interests and what's not is a British liberal outlook. It's where Rousseau picked this up, but it develops in the 17th and 18th century in England as a direct assault on the questions of the development of identity in the United States and the colonies at that time. Colonies that were showing clear signs of self-government. So how do we think of this then in terms that are sufficient? Well, this is the idea of the nation state. The nation state is a defining factor of the individual. You can't remove it. It'd be like removing the individual from gravity, to remove the individual from the concept of the nation state. It's not as if it's a black or white perspective when the nation state was introduced and when it wasn't. You can go as far back into ancient Greece and perhaps even earlier, though it's not as well recorded. So there were at least elements of the idea of the nation state, obviously started in some ways with the city state, but there were even attempts, especially after the Persian War, where Athens had a sense of a responsibility. And the leading minds of Athens, people like Aeschylus, recognized that there was something intrinsically tragic about the Athenian people, that there was some institution lacking that provided them to take advantage. Just to put a quick context to this, most of the Greek islands and the areas of northern Greece had become total traitors and had joined the Persians in their attempted invasion. It was really only the Athenians, first in Marathon and then with the other Peloponnesian tribes like Sparta, Corinth, Argos, in the naval fight at Salamis, where those Greek tribes had unified. But Athens emerged out of the Persian Wars in 480 with a huge capability of support now of all of these islands in northern and potentially northern Greece as now allies into what they called the Athenian Empire. But so there was aspects of it, but it was not consolidated. It took approximately another 2,000 years before in France, a consolidation of the French people into a nation under Louis XI had finally emerged. And still, this concept of the nation state, which then was echoed in England by the Tudor monarchy, expressed elements again of a sovereign English people. But there was still something greatly lacking that was then introduced with the American Revolution. Something about the clear principles and concepts, but that in essence, that nation state is set up as a defense, as a means of empowering the individual to act while shielding from the turbulent storms of globalist insanity. However that may manifest as religious ideological insanity, like we saw with the religious wars of Europe, or the just kind of raging ethno or tribal differences that dominated in some cases the Greeks' inability to unify as a strong national power. But the ability to identify that principle of what governs a unification of a people against then that globalist or threatened ideological insanity. The idea of somehow being ultimately oppressed by some external, arbitrary, and in essence, ideological force. Force that is not abiding by truth. As Pilate says to Christ, what is truth? But this question is now accessible, that there's a deliberation amongst a people shielded from that insanity, that defends the right to pursue then the truth of the crisis that they face, because the crisis is always something developing. It's always intrinsic to wherever we're situated, right? There's always some problem we're going to have to solve. There's some question of how do we expand our ability for growth and new freedoms? And there's going to have to be some kind of solution. And it's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be something that we've done by tradition. It's something we're going to introduce in a new way. When we're at our best, a nation state presents that as a mission. We're going to solve this mission. We're going to solve this exploratory problem. We're going to go beyond what we currently know today. It may seem impossible to all of you. It may seem unpractical, but yet it's the most practical thing, because it will provide us the means and the solutions, the quality of uncomfortability, to go into the unknown, to search the stars, to search the heavens, to broaden our concepts and horizons as we consider not just the technological limitations we might face, but the cultural, social, or other aspects of one's society, that you drive that with a mission orientation. How do you finance that mission? How do you make that mission a reality? You don't leave it up to the whims of billionaire oligarchs or the individual choices of every individual. This is the principle of national credit. It's why it's such an intrinsic part of the sovereignty of a nation to say, where can we go that challenges our understanding of the universe itself, that challenges our understanding of ourselves as a people, and yet gives us a new platform, a new perspective. That's why Mr. LaRouche emphasized so strongly the colonizing and landing on the moon, and then onward to Mars. Because though there are myriad scientific and technological challenges, there is a higher cultural platform that from that purview allows us to address the crisis we face today. It also, in taking on such challenges, awakens the brilliance of the American genius that lies within all of our people, and asks it to contribute not to its own personal well-being or your families, but to the broader mission of the nation. Much like an existential war does, this is an existential question. And it's the power of the nation state that makes that possible for the individual. Without that nation state, we're reduced back more and more to an arbitrary kind of survival, not to the ability to participate in the greatest missions of mankind. And every nation has the ability to consider this. You see it. You see it in India's space program today. You see it in the UAE's space program today. Many nations recognize this is one of the most powerful ways to inspire its young people and to give its nation a sense of contributing not just to the immediate concerns, but to the actual future survival of civilization. This is the power of the nation state. This is something that's deep within the bones of the United States. We've made it more conscious and clear for other nations to consolidate that. And if we're going to return to a system of nations today, if we're going to crush this globalism, then it's paramount upon us that we recognize the power of the nation and the intrinsic responsibility of this mission orientation, of the role of national credit, the role of structuring an economy according to that future potential. This is what defines the higher concept of a credit system, the credit based on the future discoveries of American genius, rather than the monetary system of the Federal Reserve, of the debts, of the wars, and of the speculation that defines the neoliberal anti-human era. So that was basically what I wanted to present. Hopefully that provokes some questions or thoughts. Certainly we'd like to hear reports or ideas from whatever people are engaged in, but that at least sets the tone for the discussion.